All right, so it's a nice spring day, and Phil and I thought we would have another discussion, extend our discussion that we had on our last show. And a couple things we wanted to touch on were how people are, in capitalism, people are treated as like organic working capital, and a bunch of other things. Anyway, do you want to take it away, Phil?
Sure. Well, ever since economics has been coming into its own, from Adam Smith until 1820s, it's always been thought of as the dismal science. And what that started with was that England, up until about the 1770s, 1780s, had what they called a pastoral economy. And that meant most English people lived in the countryside on small farms, and they raised sheep, and they lived kind of a comfortable, sort of quaint life. And then there came then there was an imperative to industrialize and redefine the way that we talk about land tenure. And land tenure was the place where you lived, who you paid your rent to, or what part of the commons or community you were. And so around the 1770s, they decided that this was inefficient. You couldn't extract as much out of a peasant farmer as you could out of a serf, somebody that was tied to the land and almost went with it. And so the idea was to make workers come to the cities. And the cities at this time were a horrible, horrible place. I looked at some statistics, and the life expectancy of the average English factory worker in the 1830s and 1840s was like 33.
Wow.
So that's 20 years, you know, you just wouldn't be there if you worked in the factory.
Hmm.
And the way that they would make people come in and work in these horrible urban slums was they would say, okay, you have these common pastures. And before that, you all sort of raised and watched each other's animals and got the wool off the sheep and sent it to the little cottage industry was the motto for it. And they basically switched that so that when they invented, well, there was a kind of loom that was controlled with a card. It was like a sort of a computer way of putting cloth together. And it was found, especially with this and with the invention of the cotton gin, that you could get a lot more industrial production out of a guy running a cotton gin than you could get out of somebody hand cleaning cotton over a whole day where they might get a few pounds. But if you ran it through a cotton gin, it could be 400 or 500 pounds, which created a demand for what? Slavery, of course. Slavery was dying out in the late 18th century, but the invention of the cotton gin created a way of making cloth more cheaply, workers doing the same job, and they even brought kids in, little kids, 6 and 7 years old, and used them as machine tenders. And of course, many of them actually fell in the machines. Now I'm remembering as I'm pulling this together, and again, remember I'm winging this too, that my father, Ed Caveney, 1898 to 1985, was born in the 19th century, and he was a son of a rich Irish tavern owner. And so the idea was we were going to make the Caveneys socially mobile, and they were going to send my father to an academy where he would get Greek and Latin and then go to Boston College. But my father was not very cool on studying Greek and Latin, So my grandfather sent him to work 60 hours a week for 10 cents an hour at a spool mill. And so after that, education in the Caveney family was much more valued. So the question always is, with capitalism, a huge amount more stuff can be produced, but how do you regulate and distribute the surplus? And if you ask any economist about that, their reaction will be to say, well, that's the problem of the philosophers. And the philosophers will say, huh? We don't know. And so the system unfolds on its own, and it takes on almost a transcendental identity of its own, where it's like a wheel, and each commitment leads to a further commitment. each factory competes with the other factory to get the maximum amount of productivity. And the argument always is, if you feed, it's called the iron law of wages. And it says, if you feed people too much, they'll just have bigger families. And if you have bigger families, then you'll be feeding unproductive eaters. So what happens now? We're now 200 years into the future, and just briefly, it's interesting because the entry level wage for someone without a high school diploma now in Eau Claire, if they want to work for John Menard, is $20 an hour. But what's happening is there's a whole generation of kids now who are thinking, well, I'd rather not do that. I'll just work for a little while. I'll take my money and buy peasants for all my friends, and everything will be okay. But wait till that wage drops to $7 an hour, or wait till the Fed reduces the interest rates.
Yeah. Yeah, we're in an interesting time. And it's yeah, it's kind of, I don't know. I was thinking after we talked last time, we were talking about Nazis and methamphetamines.
Yeah.
And then, you and I were thinking about the comparisons between kind of corporations and nation states, I guess you could say. And kind of, it strikes me that you can draw parallels between, I don't know if the right word is corporate culture, but I guess I would think of it as like corporate culture and nationalism. Because if you watch, if you know anybody who's worked for like a ginormous, well, any company, basically they have all these corporate values, and they try to, like, I don't know, I suppose everybody's been in Walmart at a time of shift change, and you got like this cult like thing going on where the employees form a circle and start clapping and chanting, and it looks like some kind of ritualistic. I mean, it's just really bizarre, and it makes me think like, okay, so like that's kind of how like the Nazis rose up, right? Was believing in all these bizarre ritualistic, I mean, it's just strange, and it just strikes me as like these corporations, they want to pretend like they have no responsibility other than to create money to maximize the gains for the shareholders.
Yeah.
They tend to take on these values like that would be seen like in a collective of people or individuals. It's just very, very weird.
And the question we ask then is, I've been watching the stock market recently, and it's down something like 4,000 points from its high.
Mm-hmm.
What happens at the point at which the corporate culture fails? What do these people come to believe next? What do they do next?
Yeah.
It seems to me it just takes one guy like Trump to say, make America better again.
Yeah, well, that's like we don't need to always rehash, Nazi history or something, but that's basically how Hitler rose up, right? They were exploited economically, basically the people, and there was no hope for them. And I guess, yeah, if we had a complete collapse of our credit system in the way that our capitalistic system works right now, then yeah, like thank God we had thank God the economy we have right now wasn't taking place when Trump was in there, huh?
Yeah. Well, the latest thing apparently he was talking about mobilizing the army during the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and the army apparently said that they wouldn't go along with it.
Mhm.
I've listened to several little bits on it from people that were part of the command structure.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, they say that silence sometimes, it seems a lot longer than it is. Uh, would you? I want to tell you some stuff dealing with the emergence of Hitler about the World War I German famine.
Hmm.
Uh, at at the start of World War I, Germany had a population of 70 million. America had a population of about 130 billion. Russia had a population of about 170 million. France about so Germany was a relatively small country compared to America and Russia. They had allies, but the allies didn't come out for very much. But their philosophy was to always feed the soldiers first, and so they had an army that was entrenched on the Western Front and basically actually knocked revolutionary Russia out of the war. But during that time, that Germany had turned into this military monster. Something like 700,000 Germans starved to death, most of them children. And the Germans keep the records so well that it's undeniable. One woman's paper, Elizabeth Cox, noted that if you looked at German children in specific areas, you would see that after the war broke out, the height for their age dropped by an average age of 2%, or average height of 2 inches. And that's really a pretty big deal. So what you have is Germans traumatized by war, maybe fed afterwards by the good graces of the American Quakers, Herbert Hoover, but then they're raised up and they're strengthened. So they turn into perfect Nazis. It's the irony is that the German kid whose life you might have saved by giving them these high energies, it turns into the SS trooper, and that you're facing that's taking the methamphetamines so that he can extend the fight one more last distance before the system collapses.
Hmm.
Now, now, where does that come from? And why within our framework of historical study, why isn't somebody besides me talking about this?
Yeah, well, and the other thing that's interesting is okay. So if you look at what if you compare what you just talked about to a worker today, an unskilled worker, and you got inflation going up,
Yeah,
stock market prices going down. Not that that really matters to
yeah,
like an unskilled laborer,
yeah,
but so and then you make it so their job is so miserable and you can't
yeah,
get by just working one job. So you make it so they have to turn to things like methamphetamine just to try to have enough energy to charge forward on their second job. Well, that's kind of like the post World War One Germans, except it's just like it's right here. And the difference is what I found interesting when you were saying, well, the Germans had this policy of feeding their soldiers first. Well, here, if you want to think of our workers as kind of like, like the corollary to the soldiers, because they're, like they're not feeding their soldiers. We're not feeding our soldiers first. We're feeding all the colonels and admirals or whatever. You know what I mean? But like the soldiers are just supposed to fight in our system the way it is. And I mean, if you were a healthcare worker, the last 2 years, it kind of was like you were in a war zone. So it's just kind of interesting, like the system that we're in, it works good for a couple percent of the people, but not necessarily for the rest.
Well, from my lived experience, I mean, I spent 7.5 months in a nursing home recovering from a perfect storm of comorbidities, and that gave me a chance to see inside the lives of most caregivers and to realize that whether I lived or died depended on the first-hand care that they gave me when I needed it. And your story could be a case study to the general one of the care worker, often a female, going from one to another and trying job to another and trying to feed their family. What they documented, what Elizabeth Cox documented, and I guess I'm going to contact her now, is what would happen was that the the mothers would starve to keep the children alive as long as they could, and then they would die, and then the children would die, and you think, what monstrosity did this come out of? And then you have a deranged guy like Hitler, full of rage, seeing this happen, realizing that even after the armistice, the blockade was kept in effect in England, and he fills the world with hatred and rage, and it's going to stick the first place that it has traction. It could be anyway. It could have been. It could have just as well been. Well, I don't know. I guess that international Jews and capitalism were all put together. I guess the idea with Hitler was anything that was different from what they believed in, with their bogus ideas of ethnic purity, was liable to destruction. And he had a Hobbesian idea of what it was like with the nation state, where life is nasty, brutal, mean, and short. And the way we survive is not by cooperating like the Quakers did and trying to feed people, but going and killing someone else and taking their food. I wrote an article about this almost about 50 years ago, going and robbing your neighbor. I mean,
Kind of like corporate acquisitions and mergers and stuff, isn't it?
it is, yeah. And again, whatever you can do to cut jobs increases profit. And something else that's developed over my lifetime is CEO salaries. When I studied uh, when I took Russian political science at UW-Madison, we read a classic book by Meryl Feinsard, and they said that the equivalent of corporate executives, made about 6 or 7 times as much as the average Soviet worker, sort of like it was in America. Because at that time that I was taking that course, you look at like McNamara and people like that, and even Henry Kissinger, and they didn't start making money until well after World War II. because it was just thought that it was part of your job, and there wasn't an ethical corporate culture. I mean, McNamara, after the Second World War, needed former Secretary of Defense, needed a job where he and his wife, even though he was key to our defense industry, he needed a job where, because he and his wife had both had polio, that they needed health care. And by the time he died, he was worth something like $100 million. But that was not necessarily him. It was the corporate culture that it's almost like these CEO salaries. It's like owning a battleship or something like that. Each company brags about their CEO salary, and the whole culture is like some proud tower teetering on the edge of things. And the people who who would benefit have no idea it's coming down.
Yeah, did you do you know the story of how CEO started making so much?
Go ahead.
So so basically it's like you said, like I can't remember the timeline. It was a long time ago that I read about this. But, like 50 years ago, it was people would complain how much money that the executives made compared to the frontline workers. And it was like you said, it was like 6 or 7 times, it was, maybe 10 times, but it wasn't like it is now, 1,000 times or even more. And as a result of that, what ended up happening is all probably academics mostly, were all bitching about this and how unfair it was. And when it really came to a head, the corporations were doing badly. And so you would have periods of time where a company's stock would go down in value, yet the CEO was still making 10 times what the average worker was making.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said, so then all these people bitched, and they're like, well, it should be tied to performance of their salary should be tied to performance of their company. Fast forward today, well, that's what you have. What they didn't understand was that these people that were all complaining about this were too stupid to understand that these people are right at that Cantillon River we talked about, scooping out that river. And as the Fed is printing more and more money, they're right next to it. And so it's practically impossible for companies not to make a lot more money over time just because of inflation. So it's baked right in. All the people bitching got what they wanted, but the end result is not what they wanted. So it's kind of funny in a way, I think. Like when you get these super liberal think tanks that have these pie in the sky ideas, but haven't really operated in reality. This is the result of the I kind of see him like an Elizabeth Warren type thing where she picks these fights that she doesn't understand the first thing about any of it. So it's just kind of like that's what you get.
The thing we've not even talked about, and I'm going to bring this in now. John Kenneth Galbraith was he was a brilliant economist. He was a Keynesian, and he had a model of American society, or for that matter, Western industrial society, where you had countervailing influences. And what that meant with these in the corporate world is you had labor unions, and labor unions at a certain time, uh, they might decide, well, we don't need more money. We've got enough money, but we sure would like more vacation. But we sure would like better health insurance. But we sure would like a retirement plan. And since things were growing at that time in a certain way, then they could sort of work out a deal. And I'm a beneficiary of a public employment retirement plan, the kind of which even now big corporate guys wouldn't dream of having. I talked to a Chinese economist. He said, "What did you earn? What did you do meritoriously to deserve such a fine pension. I said, I was lucky. 53 years ago, 52 years ago, there was a box I should check. I checked the right box. But that box is no longer available. And I know seemingly, lower to mid-level healthcare workers are being put in very physically demanding kinds of work situations. I know several cases where people would have preferred to sit all night doing lab work, but just because some bean counter thought it would be better if they didn't, or he could do that, they had to stand all night. Guess what? A lot of them had to retire early because their feet, you stand all night on concrete, your feet get so well.
Well,
You know that.
think that was intentional? I mean, they've done all people. Companies want to get rid of older workers.
Well, I know I'm not going to mention its name, but yeah, we have several examples of that because a machine doesn't ever take a sick day. A machine doesn't ever show up with a hangover. A machine doesn't ever go and hide in a chair, do they?
No, and a machine doesn't make more money over time. They get cheaper over time. They
Yeah.
don't. They don't. Their salary doesn't increase over time. And the machine doesn't become complacent over time.
And when you get to that high end of the multiplier effect with Moore's law, that's where you see them really get cheaper and more inclined to do work that we thought of as being paraprofessional. It wasn't.
Right. Well, what do you think? We covered quite a bit of ground there. You think we should end there for today?
Yeah, I think we should end there, and I think we should keep doing this. And
I kind of just winging it and making these.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm gonna stop the recording there, and we'll see anybody watching. We'll see you next time.
Okay.